Years later, as Emily and Grace grew into young women, they often asked him to retell the story of that night at Liardenlau. And every time Daniel's voice caught when he reached the part where they looked up at him through the railing and asked for leftovers. That was the moment, he would say, his eyes misty, the moment I realized I had been starving for something all my wealth could not buy, and that night you two gave it back to me. The legacy of Anna lived on in them, in their kindness, their resilience, and their laughter. And Daniel's legacy shifted from skyscrapers and profits to something infinitely greater, lives touched, futures rebuilt, hope restored. When he looked at the girls, his daughters, he saw not just what he had given them, but what they had given him: redemption, purpose, and love. In the quiet of his home, long after the world had stopped asking questions and moved on to other stories, Daniel would sometimes sit with his journal. The once half-empty pages were now filled with words not of transactions but of memories. Emily's first school play, Grace's gentle way of helping others, the sound of their laughter on summer mornings. On the final page he wrote, "True wealth is not measured by what we keep for ourselves, but by what we give away. And true success is not the empire we build, but the love we leave behind." And so, the lonely CEO who once dined alone in the city's finest restaurant became remembered not for the size of his fortune, but for the depth of his compassion. His story echoed beyond his lifetime, reminding all who heard it that sometimes the smallest voices, the timid request of two little girls, could awaken the greatest transformation in a man's soul. One evening, as the fading sun painted the room in gold, Anna asked Daniel to sit with her after the twins had gone to bed. She looked weaker than he had ever seen her, yet her gaze was clear and unwavering. "Daniel," she whispered, her voice raspy, "we both know I won't be here much longer." Daniel shook his head instinctively as though denial could somehow alter fate. "Don't say that," he murmured. "You're stronger than you think. We'll find another treatment." But Anna placed her hand over his, her grip surprisingly steady. "No, we must speak honestly for their sake. Emily and Grace need more than memories. They need someone who will fight for them when I no longer can." Her eyes softened, and for the first time since he had met her, Daniel saw not just the proud mother protecting her children, but a woman willing to entrust her most precious treasure to another. "I've watched you, Daniel. You've given more than money. You've given time, love, stability. You kept every promise, and I believe you were sent here for them." The words struck him harder than any accusation or praise he had ever known. Tears blurred his vision, but he did not look away. "Anna," he whispered, his voice trembling, "are you asking me?" She nodded faintly. "When I am gone, I want you to raise them. Not out of obligation, not as charity, but as a father. They already see you as one, though they may not say it aloud. And I see it too. You belong to them as much as they belong to you." For a long moment, silence filled the room, broken only by the distant hum of the city outside. Daniel felt his chest tighten, as though his entire life had been leading to this moment, to this choice. The man who once measured success by profit margins now found his greatest calling in two small lives that had begun with a simple request for leftovers. At last he nodded, his voice quiet but rehearsed. "Salute. I promise you, Anna, they will never be alone. I will raise them as my own, love them as you have, and ensure that your spirit lives on in everything they do." Tears slipped down Anna's cheeks, but her smile was radiant. "Then I can rest knowing they are safe." Weeks later, Anna passed peacefully in her sleep, with Daniel by her side and the twins curled against her, their tiny hands wrapped around her frail fingers. The grief was unbearable, yet beneath it was a strange, steady strength. Anna had entrusted him with her daughters, and Daniel knew he could not fail. The days that followed were heavy with sorrow, but they were also filled with decisions that defined the rest of his life. Daniel filed the paperwork, went through every legal process, and adopted Emily and Grace as his daughters. The moment the judge confirmed it, the girls clung to him, their tears wetting his suit, their small voices whispering, "Papa." It was the first time they had ever called him that, and it shattered what remained of his old self. He was no longer the lonely CEO. He was a father. From that moment, his life transformed in ways he had never imagined. The penthouse, once a monument to his isolation, became a home filled with laughter, drawings taped to the walls, toys scattered across polished floors, and the smell of pancakes on Saturday mornings. Board meetings were rescheduled around school recitals and bedtime routines. Investors, once skeptical, began to see a new kind of leader in him, one who led not only with intellect but with heart. The Whitmore Foundation grew rapidly, fueled not just by money but by his story. He told the world openly of the day two little girls had asked him for leftovers, and how that moment had changed everything. His vulnerability, once seen as weakness, inspired thousands. Employees volunteered in communities, partners contributed funds, and the public rallied behind a vision of corporate leadership driven by compassion rather than greed. The empire he had built no longer stood as a tower of cold glass. It became a beacon of hope. Gasps rippled through the crowd, but Daniel pressed forward, unflinching. If you believe compassion makes me weak, then so be it. If you believe caring for the forgotten diminishes my worth as a leader, then perhaps you should find another man to sit in this chair. But I will tell you this, for the first time in decades, I am not lost. I am not empty. I am alive with purpose. He paused, letting his words sink deep into every corner of the hall. Then he revealed what he had written in his journal. Today, I am announcing the Whitmore Foundation, a commitment not of charity, but of justice. Our profits will not merely build towers of glass. They will build schools, fund hospitals, create homes, and restore dignity to those who have been left behind. We will not just be a corporation. We will be a force for humanity. The atrium erupted, some in applause, others in murmurs of shock. Cameras captured the moment, sending it streaming into households worldwide. And though Daniel knew critics would still twist his words, he also knew something irreversible had begun. He had shattered the wall between business and compassion, proving that leadership could be redefined. That evening, when he returned to Anna's apartment, the twins greeted him with radiant smiles. "Uncle Daniel," Emily cried, pulling him inside, "we saw you on TV. You talked about helping people like us." Grace nodded eagerly, her eyes wide with pride. "Mama said you were brave." Daniel turned toward Anna, who lay on the couch, her face pale but glowing with a quiet pride. "You kept your promise," she whispered, her voice faint yet strong in meaning. "You stood not just for us, but for so many others." For Daniel, the recognition in her eyes was more valuable than any applause from the world outside. He sat with the twins that night, telling them stories of hope, of a world where kindness could spread like light in the darkness. As they drifted to sleep beside him, he realized the breakthrough was not just in the company, not just in the public's perception. The true breakthrough was within him. For the first time in his life, Daniel Whitmore was no longer defined by his loneliness, his wealth, or his reputation. He was defined by the lives he touched, the promises he kept, and the courage he had found to be vulnerable. The man who once dined alone at the finest restaurants was now a man who belonged, not to an empire of steel and glass, but to a fragile family that had taught him what love truly meant. And though Anna's health still cast a shadow over the future, Daniel understood now that even in loss there could be legacy. Even in struggle, there could be strength. The breakthrough was not an ending, but a beginning. A promise that whatever came next, he would face it not as the lonely CEO, but as the man who had finally discovered what it meant to live with purpose. The legacy. Spring returned to the city slowly, as if reluctant to release the hold of winter. The snow melted into streams that rushed along gutters, and small green shoots pressed through cracks in the sidewalks, stubborn in their determination to live. For most, spring symbolized renewal, a chance to begin again. But for Daniel, spring carried both renewal and the heavy awareness of something inevitable. Anna's time was running out. Her illness had advanced despite every effort, every doctor, every treatment Daniel had quietly arranged. There were good days when she managed to sit at the table, helping the girls with their lessons, her laughter fragile but present. And there were harder days when even speaking drained her strength, when she lay still on the couch, her hand limp in his as the girls pressed close on either side. Through it all, Anna's eyes carried the same fierce determination that had always defined her, but also the quiet acceptance of someone who knew her body was surrendering, even as her spirit fought to stay. The breakthrough. The storm of public curiosity swelled until it could no longer be ignored. What had begun as whispers on social media became columns in financial newspapers, interviews on morning talk shows, and debates on business panels. Some called him a saint, a man finally showing that wealth should serve humanity. Others mocked him as unstable, a leader who had lost focus. For weeks, Daniel watched his name flicker across television screens paired with headlines that reduced his choice to sound bites. CEO's secret life. Daniel Whitmore, savior or sympathizer? Is compassion weakness in the corporate world? The scrutiny would have crushed the man he had once been, the one who lived for reputation and measured his worth by public approval. But now, standing in the middle of this tempest, Daniel found a strange calm. What gave him strength was not the approval of the masses, but the small family that had come to anchor his soul. Emily and Grace, who once trembled outside a restaurant asking for leftovers, now met him at the door each evening with laughter and excitement, their little hands reaching for his as though he were the most important man in the world. Anna, though growing weaker, would still tilt her head and offer him a faint smile whenever he entered, as if to remind him that dignity could survive even in frailty. In their presence, the noise of the outside world faded. They did not care about his title or his bank account. They cared only that he was there, that he kept his promises, that he listened, that he stayed. Still, Daniel understood that silence in the face of criticism could only last so long. His employees were beginning to ask questions. His partners were whispering about replacing him. And beyond the walls of the corporate empire he had built, he saw a society where countless families like Anna's struggled in shadows. One evening, eating in his office high above the glittering skyline, he opened his journal, the same worn red book that had accompanied him through years of empty victories. This time, however, he did not fill it with notes about strategy or reminders of meetings. Instead, he wrote with the clarity of a man who finally understood why he had been given so much. The next morning, he called for a company-wide assembly. Thousands of employees filled the atrium of Whitmore Industries, while countless more tuned in through live broadcast screens across the globe. The murmurs were thick with expectation. Many thought he might resign. Others feared he would confirm the rumors of distraction. Daniel walked onto the stage not in his usual armor of pride, but with the quiet strength of a man who had found his purpose. He stood before them, scanning the sea of faces, then began to speak. For years, he said, his voice steady but rich with emotion, I believed that success was measured by numbers, profits, expansions, towers that reached higher than the rest. And by those measures, yes, we succeeded. But what I did not see, what I blinded myself to, was that in building these towers, I had forgotten the people who lived in their shadows. The room fell into a silence that was not just respectful but hungry, the kind of silence that begged for truth. Daniel continued, his voice gaining momentum. Some of you have heard rumors about me. Yes, they are true. I have been spending time in places that our wealth and privilege often overlook. I have met children who survive on scraps while we feast. I have met mothers who sacrifice everything just to see their children live another day. And in those places, I found something I had lost long ago, my humanity. She studied him for a long time, her tired eyes searching his face. Finally, she nodded faintly. Then promise me one thing, she said softly. Promise me you won't walk away when it becomes hard. Promise me you'll be there, not just as a benefactor, but as a man who truly cares. The words pierced him deeper than any business rival's accusation or any boardroom challenge. He swallowed hard, leaning forward, his voice low and certain. I promise. But promises, he soon discovered, carried weight. As winter pressed on, his quiet acts of care began to draw attention beyond the walls of that small apartment. A photograph surfaced online, grainy, taken by a passerby, of Daniel in his expensive coat carrying bags of groceries into a rundown building. Soon, whispers spread across social media and among business circles. The wealthy CEO spending time in the slums, feeding children, caring for a sick woman. At first it was harmless speculation, but in the hands of gossip it grew sharp. Some praised him as compassionate, but others mocked him as weak, suggesting his empire would crumble if he continued wasting energy on sentiment. Journalists soon followed. One evening as he left the building, cameras flashed, microphones shoved toward his face. "Mr. Whitmore, is it true you've been living a double life?" one reporter shouted. "Are these children yours?" another asked cruelly, twisting the story into scandal. Daniel's jaw clenched as he shielded his face, refusing to answer, but inside, fury boiled, not for himself, but for the invasion into the fragile world of Anna and the twins. When the board summoned him for an emergency meeting, the room bristled with judgment. "Your behavior is reckless," one partner sneered. "We are managing billions, Daniel. Investors want stability, not a CEO playing social worker in alleyways." Daniel stood at the head of the table, his face unring, eatable but his heart on fire. "Do you know what instability is?" he asked, his voice like steel. "Instability is a child begging for food while men like us feast in towers of glass. Instability is believing that profit matters more than people. If you cannot stomach a leader who remembers his humanity, then perhaps I am not the leader you deserve." The room erupted in protests, but Daniel no longer feared their disapproval. The moment he saw those twins eating with joy, he had been reborn into a man who would not measure his worth by quarterly reports alone. Still, he knew the struggle was only beginning. The media would not relent. The board would not forgive easily. And most painfully, Anna's health continued to decline. One night when snowflakes drifted outside the cracked window, Grace climbed into his lap while he sat in the old armchair beside Anna's couch. She looked up at him with wide, innocent eyes. "Uncle Daniel," she whispered, a name she and Emily had begun using naturally. "If Mama goes to heaven, will you still come see us?" Daniel's throat tightened. He hugged her close, feeling her small heartbeat against his chest. "Grace," he whispered, his voice trembling, "no matter what happens, I will never leave you. You and Emily will never be alone, I promise." As she drifted to sleep against him, Daniel realized the full weight of what he was stepping into. He was no longer an occasional helper, no longer an outsider offering charity. He was becoming part of them, entwined in their struggles, their hopes, their fears. And though the world outside tried to shame him for it, he understood that this struggle was not his downfall. It was his salvation. For the first time in years, Daniel Whitmore was fighting a battle not for profit, but for love. And though the outcome was uncertain, he knew with absolute clarity that it was the only fight worth giving ever. Her words sank deep into him. For so long he had believed his identity was tied to his empire, his reputation, his relentless drive. But in this small, fragile family, he found a reflection of something truer, a man capable of compassion, a man who could still be more than a lonely figure staring at city lights from a glass tower. That night, as he walked home through streets lit with festive decorations, Daniel felt a quiet revelation settle over him. His life was not simply changing, it was being rebuilt. Not with stone and steel, not with contracts and deals, but with love, laughter, and the courage to be vulnerable again. He understood now that wealth meant nothing if it could not be used to lift others. And he realized, with a mixture of fear and hope, that perhaps he needed Emily, Grace, and Anna as much as they needed him. The transformation was not complete, nor was it easy. The world would question him, his board would resist, and his own insecurities would return. But for the first time in his life, Daniel Whitmore was not afraid of the struggle, for he had discovered something far greater than success. He had discovered purpose. The struggle. Winter arrived with a sharp bite that seemed to seep into the bones of the city. The wealthy decorated their homes with golden lights, shop windows displayed opulence dressed in ribbons and glass ornaments, and restaurants brimmed with laughter and warmth. Yet just a few streets away, families curled under worn blankets, praying that the heater would last another night. For Daniel Whitmore, the season brought not just cold winds, but also a storm within his heart. His visits to Anna and the twins had become an anchor in his life, yet with each passing day he noticed something he had tried desperately not to see. Anna's condition was worsening. At first it was subtle, the slight tremor in her hands when she lifted a cup, and the way she paused mid-sentence to catch her breath, the longer silences between her words. Daniel had convinced himself these were temporary, that better nutrition and rest would restore her strength. But as the days grew shorter, her cough deepened, her body grew frailer, and the light in her eyes dimmed with exhaustion. Even as she tried to reassure him with a faint smile, Daniel could see the truth that terrified him. She was fading. The twins sensed it too, though they tried to mask their fear with chatter and playfulness. Emily would cling to her mother's side, watching closely whenever Anna shifted or coughed. Grace, gentler by nature, began imitating small caregiving gestures, placing a pillow behind Anna's back, fetching water when she coughed. They carried responsibilities no child should know, yet they bore them with quiet courage. Daniel's heart ached every time he saw them, knowing that no matter how many resources he provided, there were battles money could not win. He brought doctors, specialists from the best hospitals in the city, but Anna's pride bristled every time they arrived. "You're doing too much," she whispered one evening when the girls had gone to bed. Her voice was frail but firm. "They will need to be strong, Daniel. Don't shield them from reality too much. Life will not always give them comfort." Daniel sat across from her, his chest heavy. And yet, should they not have at least some comfort? Should they not know what it feels like to be children, even for a little while? His eyes glistened as he looked at her thin frame beneath the blanket. "Anna, I have more than I could ever spend. Let me give them something beyond survival. Let me give them joy." The words were intended as counsel, but to Daniel they sounded like chains clinking shut. He looked at the man, then at the others who nodded in agreement, and for a moment, he saw them not as colleagues but as reflections of his former self. People who believed success was measured only in profits, blind to the truth that life was more than numbers on a balance sheet. He took a long breath before speaking. "Perhaps," he said evenly, "the problem is not that I am distracted, but that I am finally focused on what matters beyond this boardroom." His voice carried a weight that silenced the room. If our empire cannot bear the humanity of its leader, then perhaps it is not as strong as we claim. Gasps and murmurs rippled across the table, but Daniel did not flinch. For the first time in years, he felt no fear of their judgment. That night, as he returned to Anna's apartment, he found Emily and Grace waiting by the door with wide smiles. They rushed to him, pulling at his hand, eager to show him the puzzles they had completed and the new words they had learned. Anna sat nearby, her tired eyes lighting up at the sight of her daughter's joy. Daniel felt something swell inside him, something that no boardroom victory had ever given him. Here there was no agenda, no strategy, no hidden motive, only genuine connection. Over the following weeks, his actions deepened. He quietly arranged for better medical care for Anna, though he respected her wish for dignity by ensuring the doctors presented it as routine visits rather than charity. He enrolled the girls in a better school, covering the fees anonymously so Anna could believe it was a scholarship. He even had the apartment repaired discreetly through a local landlord he persuaded with an investment, so that the leaking ceiling and broken heater were suddenly fixed without explanation. To the outside world, these were small acts, invisible threads woven into the fabric of everyday life. But to Daniel they were monumental because they marked the first time in decades he was using his wealth not to build walls but to build bridges. And still the greatest change was internal. He began waking up with a sense of anticipation rather than dread. He found himself lingering in the grocery aisle choosing snacks he thought the twins might enjoy. He noticed himself listening more deeply to his employees, speaking with more patience, even smiling at strangers on the street. The loneliness that once clung to him like a second skin was thinning, replaced by a warmth he had thought long dead. It was as though the fortress around his heart was slowly crumbling, brick by brick, not through force, but through the gentle persistence of two small hands tugging him forward. One evening, as winter began to settle and the city streets glittered with holiday lights, Daniel found himself sitting with Anna while the twins slept in the next room. The apartment was quiet except for the faint sound of their steady breathing. Anna looked at him for a long time before speaking. "You're changing," she said softly, her voice both weary and knowing. Daniel turned to her, surprised. "Am I?" She nodded. "When I first saw you at the restaurant, you looked like a man surrounded by walls. Even your kindness that night felt guarded. But now you look like a man who has let some of those walls fall." Daniel leaned back, staring at the flickering light from the small lamp. "I suppose you're right. I built those walls to protect myself. Success demanded it, but lately, I wonder if they were protecting me or imprisoning me." Anna's lips curved into the faintest smile. Sometimes it takes losing yourself to find who you really are, and though Anna still reminded him not to go too far, she began to soften, recognizing that his presence was not pity, it was genuine care. One evening as he prepared to leave, Emily ran after him down the hallway, her small shoes slapping against the worn floorboards. She tugged at his sleeve. When he turned, she whispered, "We prayed last night, Grace and me. We asked God to send us someone to help Mama. Maybe that's you." For a moment, Daniel could not speak. The weight of her words pressed against the hollow places inside him, filling them with something he could not name. He bent down, looking into her bright eyes. "Maybe," he whispered back. "Maybe it is." As he walked away that night, Daniel knew his choice was made. This was no longer about easing his conscience or making gestures of goodwill. It was about commitment. It was about stepping into their world, not as a visitor, but as someone willing to carry part of their burden. For the first time in decades, he realized he was not running from loneliness anymore. He was running towards something greater, and though he could not see the full road ahead, he felt certain of one truth. The path he had chosen would change him forever. The transformation. The weeks melted into months, and with every passing day, Daniel Whitmore began to feel the tectonic plates of his life shifting beneath him. What had once been a rigid structure of board meetings, investor calls, and ruthless negotiations was slowly giving way to something more fluid, something more human. Each time he visited the dim apartment where Anna and her daughters lived, it was as though he stepped through an invisible doorway between two worlds. In one world, he was the CEO, polished and unflinching, commanding skyscrapers and steering corporations. In the other, he was simply Daniel, a man who sat cross-legged on the floor with two little girls. While they showed him their crayon drawings, a man who helped fold laundry that smelled faintly of detergent and damp walls, a man who listened to Anna's stories of the past while she leaned back against worn cushions, her voice frail but her spirit unbroken. It was not only their lives that were being sustained by his presence, it was his own. He found himself smiling without realizing it, laughing at Emily's mischievous jokes, marveling at Grace's tender heart when she insisted on saving the last piece of bread for her mother. He, who had once viewed vulnerability as a liability, now found strength in allowing himself to feel. For so long he had buried his emotions beneath layers of work and wealth, convinced that success required sacrifice, but here, in the warmth of that cramped home, he discovered that sacrifice without love was hollow. Yet the transformation was not without resistance. His board of directors grew restless, whispering that their CEO was distracted. One evening, as he stood before them in a sleek glass-walled conference room high above the city, he could sense their unease. Charts and projections flashed on the screen behind him, but the tension in the room was not about numbers, it was about him. "Daniel," one senior partner said finally, leaning forward with steepled fingers, "we have noticed your unusual commitments lately, spending time in certain neighborhoods, associating with families far removed from our circles. This is not good for your image. Investors want a leader focused on growth, not distracted by sentimentality." He had never been one to carry groceries, yet that afternoon he carried them up the creaking stairs of Anna's building. When the twins opened the door, their eyes widened at the sight of him holding enough food to fill their small kitchen. Anna, however, did not react with delight. She sat up on the couch, her face pale but her gaze sharp. "Mr. Whitmore, I told you," she began, But Daniel raised his hand gently. "I know," he said. "You don't want charity, I understand. But this isn't charity. Think of it as investment." Anna frowned. "Investment?" Daniel nodded. "Yes. You raised these two remarkable little girls with almost nothing, and yet they are bright, kind, and strong. That's proof of the greatest return on investment I've ever seen. All I'm doing is giving you resources to continue that work." The twins giggled softly at the idea of themselves being called an investment, but Anna's expression softened just slightly. She tried to speak but coughed, covering her mouth with a trembling hand. Daniel moved closer, not out of pity but concern. "Please," he said quietly, "let me help in whatever way you'll allow." After a long silence, Anna finally nodded. "On one condition," she whispered. "Do not make them feel like beggars. If you give, give with dignity. They are my daughters. They deserve to hold their heads high." Daniel felt something stir deep inside, a respect he hadn't felt in years. He bowed his head. "Then that is exactly how it will be." From that day on, Daniel's life began to split in two. By day, he was still the commanding CEO, sharp-suited and calculating in meetings, his voice steady as he signed deals worth millions. But by evening, when the city lights began to glow, he became something else entirely. He found himself walking the uneven streets, carrying bags of food or books, sometimes even toys he had never thought to buy before. He sat with Anna, listening to her speak of her teaching days, the students she once inspired, the dreams she had for her daughters before illness stole her strength. He read to Emily and Grace from old storybooks, his voice unfamiliar even to himself as it softened to match their laughter. Yet the greatest transformation was not in them, it was in him. For years, Daniel had been surrounded by sycophants and rivals, by people who wanted from him or wanted to be him, but never people who simply were with him. In the cramped warmth of that broken apartment, he discovered something startling, joy in the ordinary. Grace tugging his sleeve to show him a drawing, Emily leaning against him as he read. Anna's tired smile as she watched her daughters fall asleep, knowing for one night they would not go hungry. Still, the world outside did not understand. Word reached his business circle that Daniel Whitmore was wasting time in slums, that he was distracted from his empire. At a board meeting one evening, a senior partner leaned across the table and said with thinly veiled contempt, "Daniel, people are noticing your extracurricular activities. You're not running a charity, you're running an empire. Don't let sentimentality weaken you." Daniel's jaw tightened. He stared at the man across from him, realizing with cold clarity how empty those words now sounded. Once he might have agreed. Once he might have dismissed compassion as weakness. But now, after nights of seeing two children eat with gratitude as though every crumb were gold, he understood something deeper. Perhaps true strength was not in hoarding wealth but in daring to share it. He didn't answer the partner's rebuke with words, but the fire in his eyes silenced the room. As weeks passed, his visits became a rhythm. Sometimes he arrived with food, sometimes with medicine for Anna, sometimes simply with himself. He never arrived empty, but he also never arrived out of obligation. He began to look forward to those evenings more than any luxury dinner, more than any applause from investors. For the first time in years, Daniel felt stripped of his titles, his armor of wealth. Here, in this broken apartment with two fragile children and their ailing mother, he was not a CEO. He was just a man, confronted with the raw truth of suffering he could no longer ignore. The girls had returned to his side, clutching the blanket he had given them, their eyes watching him with silent expectation. In that moment, Daniel realized something. This was not a problem money alone could fix. It was not about writing a check or making a donation. It was about presence, about showing up, about allowing himself to be vulnerable enough to care. He stayed for nearly an hour that night, listening more than speaking. He learned their names, Emily and Grace, the twins, and their mother, Anna. He learned that Anna had once worked as a teacher before her health failed, that she had been raising her daughters alone ever since. He learned that every day was a struggle, but every night ended with the twins curled beside her, their small voices singing lullabies to help her rest. When Daniel finally stood to leave, Anna's eyes softened slightly. "Thank you," she murmured. though pride still edged her tone. For the food. But don't trouble yourself further. We'll manage. Daniel looked at her, then at the girls. I believe you will, he said. But sometimes, even the strongest need someone to stand with them. He left the apartment that night with his mind heavy and his heart unsettled. The neon lights of the city no longer glittered with promise. They glared with contrast. He had always believed loneliness was the price of success. But as he walked back through the streets, one thought echoed again and again. Perhaps success meant nothing if it could not be shared. The choice. The following days were unlike any Daniel had known in years. Normally his schedule was dictated with the precision of a machine. Meetings stacked like bricks, calls spanning time zones, contracts signed before sunset, and reports piled high on his desk. Yet now, amid all the wealth and bustle of his empire, there was a constant intrusion. A pair of small faces, wide eyes filled with both caution and wonder, whispering at the edge of his thoughts. The memory of Emily and Grace lingered not like an inconvenience but like a quiet storm inside him, a reminder that there existed a reality untouched by profit margins and stock values, a reality he could no longer pretend did not exist. At first he tried to suppress it. He told himself he had done enough by offering food and comfort. He reminded himself that their mother, proud and protective, had asked him not to interfere. He even buried himself in work, hoping that the whirl of deals and numbers would wash the image of those fragile shoulders carrying oversized burdens from his mind. But the human heart, no matter how carefully trained to be indifferent, has a way of revolting when faced with innocence suffering in silence. And so every night, when he returned to his penthouse overlooking the skyline, he found himself staring out at the city not with triumph, but with emptiness. He had wealth, yet he felt impoverished. He had power, yet he felt powerless. On the third night, Daniel made a decision. It wasn't dramatic, not the kind of grand gesture that would make headlines, but a simple, quiet choice. He told himself that if he could not erase the memory of those twins, then perhaps he was meant to act. And if Anna, their mother, would not accept help openly, then he would find ways to support her discreetly, ways that respected her pride, yet ensured the girls never had to beg for food again. The next day, he diverted his driver away from the gleaming avenues of wealth and directed him back to the broken streets where the family lived. He stopped at a grocery store, an act so foreign to him that the cashier gave him a surprised second glance as he piled bags of fresh fruit, milk, vegetables, and bread onto the counter. The girls froze when his shadow fell across them. The bolder one instinctively pulled her sister closer, her tiny chin lifting in a show of bravery that barely masked her fear. Daniel crouched down, trying to make his tall frame less imposing. His voice came out softer than he expected. I saw you last night, he said. At the restaurant, do you remember? They exchanged a cautious glance. The quieter one nodded, almost imperceptibly. I brought food, Daniel continued. He held out a bag he had purchased earlier from a nearby bakery. The warm scent of bread drifted out as he opened it, revealing sandwiches and small pastries. Their eyes widened, but they did not reach for it. Instead, the bolder one whispered, Mama said not to take from strangers. Daniel felt a lump form in his throat. He admired the mother instantly, whoever she was, for instilling caution even in desperation. Your mama is wise, he said gently. She's right. You should be careful, but maybe I don't want to be a stranger. The silence stretched. Finally, the quieter twin tugged her sister's sleeve and whispered something. The bold one relented, taking the bag slowly, as though ready to flee at the first sign of danger. Once it was in their hands, both girls began eating quickly, though they still shared bites with one another, each making sure the other had enough. Watching them, Daniel felt his chest tighten again. Is your mama nearby? He asked softly. They nodded. The bolder one spoke between bites. She's home. She's sick. We help her. Something about the word home struck Daniel. He imagined a warm place, laughter, safety, yet the way the girl's eyes dulled when she said it suggested otherwise. He hesitated, then asked, May I see her? I just want to know she's safe. They froze again, torn between loyalty to their mother's warning and the instinct to accept help. At last the quiet, Tear One whispered, "Maybe, if you promise." Daniel placed his hand over his chest. "I promise. Only to help." Reluctantly, they stood and motioned for him to follow. They led him through winding streets where neon gave way to flickering bulbs, where storefronts gave way to rusting gates, and the scent of perfume gave way to damp concrete and decay. At last they stopped before a narrow building whose bricks were cracked and whose windows sagged under the weight of years. They pushed open a door that groaned on its hinges and let him inside. The apartment was dim, the only light coming from a lamp whose shade was tilted, casting more shadow than glow. The air smelled faintly of medicine and damp fabric. On a threadbare couch lay a woman, pale and thin, her breathing shallow but steady. She stirred as the door creaked open, her tired eyes focusing on the twins first, softening with love, then sharpening as they landed on Daniel. She tried to sit up, coughing lightly. "Who is this?" Her voice was weak but laced with protective suspicion. The Boulder twins stepped forward. "Mama, this is the man from the restaurant. He gave us food. He wanted to help." The woman's eyes narrowed. She glanced at Daniel's suit, his watch, his presence that screamed of another world entirely. "We don't need charity," she said firmly, though the effort of speaking made her cough again. Daniel's instinct was to retreat, to apologize and leave, but something anchored him in place. He bowed his head slightly. "I understand, and I don't mean to intrude, but when I saw them outside last night, I couldn't forget. I'm not here out of pity. I'm here because I want to do something right." The woman studied him for a long moment, as though weighing the truth of his words. Finally, she leaned back against the couch, exhaustion overtaking her. "We get by," she whispered. "They take care of me. That is enough." Daniel looked at the girls, their small shoulders carrying burdens no child should bear. His voice softened. "It's not enough. Not for them." Daniel sat frozen. The city returned to its rhythm, the clinking of glasses, the hum of traffic, the laughter from passing couples. But for him, nothing was the same. He stared at the empty plates, at the small folded marks in the blanket where their tiny hands had clutched it, and he felt something breaking inside. Loneliness, emptiness, guilt, compassion. It was all tangled together. He pressed his hand against his chest, as though steadying a wound he couldn't see. And then, almost without realizing, he whispered aloud, "What have I been doing with my life?" The next morning, Daniel Whitmore found himself unable to focus on anything. The boardroom presentation that should have commanded his full attention was nothing but a blur of numbers and graphs sliding across the screen. His executives spoke confidently, their voices rising and falling in rehearsed rhythms, but the words didn't land. He nodded when they expected it, asked a question or two when silence stretched too long, yet his mind was elsewhere. It kept returning to the terrace at Liardenlau, to the pair of small figures clutching each other on the sidewalk, to the echo of that timid request, "May we have your leftovers?" He had built his empire on decisiveness, on the ability to see opportunity where others hesitated, but now hesitation gnawed at him. The memory of those eyes, innocent yet weighed with a suffering far beyond their years, haunted him. Daniel had been trained to compartmentalize, to lock emotions away, but this time the lock refused to turn. For the first time in years, he felt as though he had failed some unspoken duty as a human being, and that feeling clung to him like a shadow. That evening, rather than retreat to his penthouse as usual, Daniel ordered his driver to take him downtown again. He gave no explanation, simply sat back as the car cut through the city streets. The neon signs had once seemed like marks of prosperity now looked garish against the silent figures huddled in alleyways and bus stops. When the car pulled up near Liardenlau, he dismissed the driver and began walking. His polished shoes clicked against the pavement, out of place among the cracked sidewalks and scattered litter. He walked for nearly half an hour before he saw them again. The twins were sitting on a concrete step outside a shuttered laundromat. The blanket he had given them was wrapped tightly around their shoulders, and between them sat a small paper bag. One of them carefully unwrapped it, splitting the contents, a half sandwich, perhaps scavenged from somewhere, into two equal halves. They shared in silence, every bite slow, deliberate, as though stretching each morsel to last. Their thin arms and pale faces spoke of hunger too familiar to be temporary. Daniel stopped a short distance away, hidden partly in the glow of a broken street lamp. He felt something twisting in his chest. It wasn't pity alone, it was recognition. A memory stirred, unbidden, from the depths of his own guarded past. He remembered being a boy of 7, clutching his younger sister's hand as they waited in a dim shelter after their father's business had collapsed. He remembered the sound of his mother trying not to cry as she told them there would be no dinner that night, only hope that tomorrow might be kinder. He had buried that memory for decades, convinced it no longer mattered, yet here it was, alive again in the sight of these two fragile children. He debated with himself for long minutes, torn between approaching them and walking away. A man like him, his face splashed across magazines, his name synonymous with ruthless business. What right did he have intruding into their world? Yet the longer he watched, the clearer it became that walking away would not silence the ache. Finally he popped forward. He had paid his way out of ever seeing it. Or so he thought. His hand tightened on the fork until his knuckles went white. He lowered it back to the plate. "Where are your parents?" he asked, his voice low. The girls exchanged a look. The quieter one tugged at her sister's sleeve. Finally, the bolder one whispered, "Mama's sick." The waiter returned just then, placing a glass of wine on the table. He followed Daniel's gaze and frowned. "Sir, don't worry. I'll have them removed. They shouldn't be loitering here." He moved as if to wave them away. "Wait!" Daniel's voice cut sharper than he intended. The waiter froze, startled. Daniel didn't raise his voice often, but when he did, people listened. He took a deep breath and softened his tone. "Bring another plate, and a blanket if you have one." The waiter hesitated. "Sir, these children—" "Another plate," Daniel repeated firmly. His gaze did not move from the girls. "And make it quick." The waiter nodded stiffly and disappeared inside. Daniel pushed his plate toward the edge of the table, closer to the railing. "Come here," he said gently. The twins hesitated, eyes darting between him and the restaurant door, as if afraid they'd be chased away. Then, holding hands, they inched closer. One placed her tiny fingers on the iron rail, peering up at him with cautious wonder. Daniel slid his plate through the gap between the bars. "Eat," he said softly. The bolder one's eyes widened. She looked at her sister, then back at him. "Really? Really?" They grabbed the plate together as if it were treasure and carried it carefully to the sidewalk. They sat cross-legged right there on the pavement, sharing bites between them. No fuss, no fighting, only quiet gratitude. Daniel watched in silence. He had eaten at the world's finest tables, dined with kings and tycoons, yet he had never seen food appreciated the way these two little girls savored each bite. The waiter returned with another plate and reluctantly a folded blanket. Daniel took them both. "Thank you," he said curtly, dismissing him. He walked to the railing again, lowering the blanket to them. The quieter twin looked up, surprised, then smiled so faintly it was like sunrise breaking through fog. Daniel's chest ached. That smile was small, fragile, but it was real. He lowered the second plate too. This time both girls whispered, "Thank you, sir," in unison, their voices trembling with joy. The sound unsettled him. He wasn't used to gratitude without strings. He wasn't used to innocence. For a while Daniel simply sat there, his wine untouched, his journal forgotten. He watched them eat in the glow of the city lights, their little shoulders wrapped in the blanket he had given. Something inside him stirred, something he had buried under years of work, wealth, and walls of pride. It frightened him because it felt like weakness, but it also warmed him because it felt like humanity. Then the girls finished, licking the last traces of sauce from the plate. They stood, still holding hands. The bolder one looked up at him once more. "Thank you," she said, louder this time, her eyes glistening. Daniel swallowed hard. "Where do you live, Oyo?" he asked. The question seemed to trouble them. They hesitated, then the quieter one tugged her sister's arm, whispering something. Finally, they shook their heads. "We can't tell," the bold one said. "Mama said not to." Daniel felt frustration, confusion, and a strange, protective urge all at once. "All right," he said carefully. "Then, take care of each other." His voice cracked just slightly. And stay warm. The twins nodded, their curls bouncing, and with one last look, they hurried down the sidewalk, disappearing into the crowd. The encounter. The night air was cool, carrying with it the faint hum of the city. Neon lights flickered from the tall glass towers, and the steady stream of cars painted streaks of red and white on the wide boulevard below. The Ardenlau, one of the most prestigious restaurants in the city, glowed with soft amber lights spilling from chandeliers. The tables on the terrace gleamed beneath candlelight, each one neatly set with polished silverware, crystal glasses, and white linen cloths. Daniel Whitmore sat at the corner table alone. His presence was commanding yet quiet. A tall man in his early 40s, his hair neatly combed, his navy suit perfectly tailored. His watch, a limited edition Swiss masterpiece, glinted under the golden light. On the table before him sat a leather-bound journal, its red cover slightly worn from years of use. He had written in it earlier, words that only he would ever read, words he never spoke aloud. Though Daniel commanded boardrooms and brokered deals worth millions, loneliness wrapped around him like a heavy coat he couldn't take off. Success had brought him wealth, power, influence, but not connection. His marriage had ended years ago. His only sibling had drifted away, unable to keep up with the sharp world Daniel had built around himself. Friends, if he had any, were transactional. Associates, investors, partners, never truly companions. Tonight was no different. The waiter placed down a perfectly plated dish in front of him. Grilled sea bass with truffle glaze, surrounded by microgreens and tiny pearls of sauce. "Excuse me, sir, your doni," the waiter murmured. Daniel nodded, offering a polite smile, but his eyes had already drifted away. Past the flickering candle, past the polished railing, past the neat rows of expensive boutiques. He was staring out toward the street. The city was alive. Couples laughed as they walked arm in arm Foss. Millies moved with strollers, and young people chatted, their voices filled with energy. Daniel's fork hovered over his plate, but he wasn't hungry. Not truly. His appetite for food often faded, just as his appetite for life seemed dulled. Then he heard it. "May we have your leftovers?" The words were soft, almost lost in the murmur of conversations and the hum of traffic, but they pierced straight through his wandering thoughts. Daniel froze, fork halfway to his mouth. Slowly he turned his head. At first he saw nothing but the iron railing of the terrace, the world beyond blurred in candlelight and shadows. But then his eyes caught movement. Two small figures stood just beyond the fence, barely tall enough for their eyes to peek over. Twin little girls, identical, no more than 5 years old. Their blonde curls were tangled, their cheeks flushed not with health but with the cold air and hunger. Their dresses were mismatched, faded from wear, and their shoes, if you could call them that, were worn, the soles nearly gone. One clutched the other's hand tightly, as if they drew strength from being together. And those eyes. Daniel had seen many things in his life. Eyes filled with greed, ambition, envy, hatred. Eyes that schemed, eyes that judged, eyes that demanded. But never had he seen eyes like these, wide, innocent, filled with both hope and sorrow. It was the kind of look that reached straight into a man's chest and twisted something he had thought long dead. He blinked, unsure if he had heard correctly. "Excuse me," he said, his voice softer than usual. The bolder of the two, though her hands trembled, spoke again. "May we have your leftovers, sir?" Her voice was so small, so careful, as if she feared even asking was a crime. For a moment, Daniel couldn't answer. He stared at the untouched sea bass on his plate, then back at them. His heart gave a strange, uncomfortable jolt. This wasn't his world. Hunger, cold, children begging for food outside restaurants like shadows on the glittering city. It wasn't supposed to touch him.